All right, guys, let's get started. Um, so this one is similar to our notes in section 2, where in section 1 we learned about circles, but in section 2 we said, well, how do we get a generic equation into the form where we can read the center of the circle and the radius of the circle, right? Um, that's what we're going to do with parabolas, because not every when you see the equation of a parabola, it won't always be in the form where you can look at it and say, oh, I know the vertex, or I know which way it opens, and those kinds of things. So we're going to have to be able to get it into the correct form. Before we talk about getting it into the correct form, let's talk a little bit about working with equations. So if I have x squared plus 8x is equal to 5. Okay, so left side's equal to the right side. We've worked with equations long enough to kind of know how things work. Now, if I want to add something to the left-hand side that wasn't originally there, so say I want to add a 2. I can't just add 2 and leave it there, because now I've changed the value of the left side, but the right side's still 5, right? So what do? We add 2 to, that's one thing that we can do. We can add 2 to this side. But what if I don't want to touch the right side? What if I want to leave the left? What if I want to keep the right side 5, but I also want to add that 2 that shouldn't have been there? What can I do? I could also take it away on the same side, right? Because if I put a 2 there and then take it back away, it still stayed that value 5. So that's the rule that we're going to work with. Whatever we're going to work with one side, and whatever we add, we got to make sure we take that away. Okay? Why do we add it? Good question. Okay? You'll see in a second. Sometimes we want to add something there. Like, why would we want to add it? Well, sometimes we want to add something there to make it conform to the form that we want. And that's what we're going to be trying. We're going to be trying to get something into descriptive form for a parabola. One more quick question. What if I have this? 2 times x squared plus 8x equals 5. And let's say I want to add, well, say I want to complete the square here. So what would I want to add? Remember, you take half that 8, so 8 divided by 2 and square it, which would be 16, right? So I added 16 to this side, but I added something that wasn't there, so now I need to account for that. So take what away? Is that true? Careful. This 16 is inside this parentheses with a 2 out in front, which means it really has a value of 2 times 16. So I should say, yeah. So these are the kinds of things we need to think about today as we're working through this, okay? So in the beginning of our notes here, we have 5 steps spelled out for you, kind of leading you through how to go and change any equation into the right form we need for parabolas. Okay, and these are good steps to refer to. If you're working on your own, you're like, what do I do first, second, and so on. And so there's an example that we walk through here. So we start with 5x squared minus y plus 30x plus 43. And I say, okay, I want you to graph that. So right now you're like, I have no idea how to graph that. Okay, so it's not in the right form. So step 1 says, let's isolate the variable that's not squared. And so you're looking at that, which one's not squared? Y is not squared. So we're going to solve for y, in other words. So we solve for y, and we end up with y as 5x squared plus 30x plus 43. Okay? We want to get it into this kind of form. Y equals something times x minus h squared plus k. We want it to look like that. Okay. And notice this x right here has a 1 in front of it, not a 5. And so this 5 right here starts to pose a problem. We can't complete the square if there's something other than 1 in front of that x squared. So step 2 says, well, take these two pieces, the 5x squared and the 30x, and factor the 5 out. Okay? In fancier language, if I read step 2, it says factor out the leading coefficient, which is 5, from the squared term and from the linear term. That's these two terms. And place the remaining term in terms in parentheses with a blank space. Okay, we're going to complete the square while writing the constant term, if any, after the parentheses. Okay, so all we're doing is factoring out the, in other words, shorter term, just factor out the 5 from these two. Okay, and so we end up with what's written here in step 2. And at this stage, very good idea. Just multiply both of these by 5 in your head just to check. Does that really equal 5x squared plus 30x? And if it does, then you're working on the right way. Okay. So again, our goal is to make it look like this. We can already see what a is going to be. What's it going to be? 5. We need to create this x minus h squared, so we need to complete the square. So that's our next step. Try to figure out what's going to go here. And you guys know how to do this. We did it with circles. What number? You don't look ahead. You cut that 6 in half and square it, and you get 9. Right? And that's what they're saying in step 3. Try to figure out what that number is. And you see in step 3, they're cutting the 6 in half and squaring it, and they're coming up with the number that should go there. And so they added that 9 there, but now they're kind of, that equal sign shouldn't belong there, right? Because they added something that didn't belong there, right? And so they need to account for that. Now it's inside, that 9 is inside parentheses, so it really has a value of 5 times 9. So by putting the 9 there, we really added 45. And so we're going to have to subtract 45, and that's what you see happening here. Okay, so they added the 9, and they subtracted the 45 to balance that equation. Once you're there, you're pretty much done. You factor, right? Factor the x squared plus 6x plus 9. That factors to the x plus 3 squared. And then 43 minus 45 is negative 2. Now we can work with this. We can graph it. We can say, okay, the vertex is negative 3, negative 2. We can find the distance from that vertex to the focus. Anything we want, that's in the form that we need. Okay, so that's what this is about. So let's look at our first example. I'm gonna skip over this part. We have it in our notes from before. Let's go to our first example. So step 1, solve for the variable that's not squared. It's already done for us. Okay, so we don't have to solve for x. Give me a second. Okay, step 2. This part right here, we need to factor the 4 out of both those. Okay, because our goal is to create a form like this: x equals something times x minus h squared plus k. That's what we want this to end up looking like. So we got to factor that 4 out first. So when I do that, I get 4 times y squared minus 8y. Leave a little space because we want to complete the square. And that plus 61 is still outside the parentheses. Okay. Check, make sure you did everything right. 4 times y squared is 4y squared. 4 times negative 8y is negative 32y. Okay. Then pick that number that's going to help us complete the square. What's it going to be? Cut negative 8 in half and square it. Positive 16. Okay. So I put that positive 16 in the parentheses, which means I probably added more than just 16. I added actually 4 times 16. So I'm going to need to subtract 4 times 16 over here. Okay. And 4 times 16 is 64. So then we're going to factor. We end up with y minus 4 squared. And this is 61 minus 64, which is negative 3. And this is the form we want. Okay. So direction, if I were to graph this, which way would the parabola open? Remember, we're looking at two things. We're looking at the x, and we're looking at that 4. And it's going to open to the right, because it's opening in the positive x direction. So it opens to the right. What's our vertex going to be? 4, negative 3. Careful. That 4 belongs to the y coordinate, so it should be negative 3, 4. And the equation, we just rewrite what we have here. Okay. So that's what it's like to put it in the form that we want. Now, sometimes when you do that second step where you factor, here we factored out the 4, sometimes you'll have to factor out a fraction, and you guys are not used to factoring fractions. You're always used to factoring integers, okay? So let's talk quickly about how to factor a fraction. If I have, first without a fraction, 7x squared plus 14x, something simple, and I say to factor that, what you're doing is you're looking at the 7 and the 14 and asking, what can I divide them both by, right? In this case, you could divide them both by 7. And so you put that, what you're dividing by outside, and you end up with 7 divided by 7 is 1, so 1x squared. 14 divided by 7 is 2. Right? That's the process we go through. So now what if we have a fraction like 2/5 x squared plus 3x? Okay, you're not used to this, but we want an x squared here, so we want to divide by 2/5. So I'm going to divide this by 2/5. I'm going to divide this by 2/5. Okay. 2/5 divided by 2/5 is what? 1. Okay, this piece right here is 1. 3 divided by 2/5. So when you're dividing by a fraction, it's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal of that fraction. So 5/2, which is going to give us 15/2. So I'm going to put plus 15/2x. Okay, so that's a little different than what we're used to. But sometimes you're going to have to divide by a fraction. In this next problem that we're going to work on, we're going to have to do that. It'll come out nicer than this, but we're going to have to do that. So let's look at the second one. So I'm just focused on the quadratic term, the x squared term, and the x term. Okay? And I'm going to factor out 1/3 from both of those. We end up with y is 1/3 times what? X squared plus 6x. Okay, and where's that coming from? Well, if I go 2 divided by 1/3, that's the same thing as 2 times 3, which is 6. That's where that 6 comes from. Okay? And here's where you may be a little not sure. And so here's where it's really important to just check. If I multiply 1/3, if I distribute that, 1/3 times x squared gives me the 1/3 x squared. 1/3 times 6 is 6/3, which is 2. And so it's really important to check at that stage, especially when you're feeling like, did I do it right? Am I not sure? Just check it. Okay. Finish this one. I'm going to pause right here. I want you to try to finish this one. Okay, so on this one, the next step was to figure out what should we add. Okay, you take half of 6 and square it, which is 9. But it really, because you're putting that 9 inside the parentheses, it has a different value than 9. It has one. It's really valued at 1/3 times 9. And so I need to add or subtract the opposite of that. Here it's positive. I need to subtract 1/3 times 9, which is really what? 3. Yes. Okay. So if you're working on one side of the equation, okay, to maintain equality, if I add something, I need to subtract it. And so I added 3, and so I need to subtract 3. Okay. After that, you want to factor. We get 1/3 x plus 3 squared plus, and then I work on this part here, and this is really 4 minus 3, which is 1. So that's what we want to end up with. It's going to be plus 3 squared because there's a positive 6x here. So if that linear term's positive, you're going to end up with a positive value in your factor. Okay. Which way does this open? Opens up because y towards the positive direction. And our vertex, -3, 1. And we got our equation. I'm just going to rewrite that. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Toughest part was factoring that 1/3 out. Just make sure you do factor a fraction out right. Okay, let's try another one. Try it from scratch. What? Okay. Okay. So on this one, you should have factored a -2 out of the first two terms. So when you factor a -2 out, you end up with y is -2 times x squared. What comes next? Minus 2x. And then you got the -5, right? That's where you go next. And just check. If I distribute that -2, do I end up with -2x squared and a plus 4x? I do. Right? So just checking to make sure you did that right. Then we complete the square. So we take half of the -2 and square it, which is 1. So you add a 1 there. But be careful, we added a 1 inside of a parentheses with a -2 out in front. So it really has a value of -2. So by putting a plus 1 inside, we actually subtracted 2. So we need to do the opposite, which is add 2. Okay? And then when we factor, we end up with y equals -2 times x minus 1 squared minus 3. Okay? Which way does this open? This opens down, good. And vertex is 1, -3. All right. One more try. One more try. Okay, on this one, you're going to factor a 4 out of the first two terms. And we get x is 4 times y squared minus y. Leave a little space to complete the square. And you got the 7/8 out here. Okay? When you're trying to figure out what to use to complete the square here, we're going to end up with a fraction because we take that -1, cut it in half, and square it, which is going to end up being positive 1/4. Okay? When I add that 1/4, it's really 4 times 1/4, so I need to subtract 4 times 1/4. And as I finish this, we get x is 4 times y minus 1/2 squared, plus, work through this, we got 7/8 minus 4/4, or 7/8 minus 8/8, which is -1/8. So it opens to the right. What's my vertex? -1/8, positive 1/2, and there's our equation.